Evening. I'm Bob Graves, and they call me the Unconventional Pastor. And it's good to be back again with you on this Sunday evening. And I enjoyed the very provocative topic that Greg Bray brought up in this last hour. I'm looking forward to continuing that next week. There's more I know that I'd like to say on that topic. And I think that in that last hour, I was really more to speak to the question of how it is we talk about it rather than actually addressing the topic itself in a way that I think would be more fruitful in a way of talking about. But anyway, I'm glad he brought it up. I thought it was provocative and relevant issue because we argue with that, and we need to really deal with that issue a little bit better. Tonight, I want to talk about, and I mentioned this on Facebook even, I want to talk about the notion of Satan and talk about this idea. And this is one of those areas where I know that I'm going to have a different opinion than a traditionalist, but not necessarily because there's strong reasons for objecting. I think I can understand and appreciate why traditionalists take the view that they do, I suppose, to a certain degree. I just don't think it's well thought through. I think it's kind of simplistic and kind of just a default reaction of being not as well informed perhaps as they could be. And that is this, that traditional Christians tend to believe that Satan is an actual real entity. And rather than some sort of personification of a dynamic going on inside of us. And of course, part of the reason, thank you, my wife brings me water. Yeah. Now, if we can only get her to turn it into wine, we'll be doing really well. Most people believe that Christians and traditional Christians believe that Satan is a very real being. And of course, part of the justification for that is that Satan is presented in Scripture in a personified manner and consistently. And I do believe that culture did turn Satan into a personification, and that's consistently how they spoke of it. But I see that more as a way of culturally maintaining the distance, the awkward distance between the tendencies we all have to do that, which is counterproductive and wrong, even evil. And that by talking about that in a very personified way, externalizes it and somehow helps to distance us from something we feel uncomfortable with, and that it becomes just for them a cultural thing. I think it's interesting to note, though, that our Christian beliefs in many ways are founded upon a tradition that came first to us as what we call Judaism, and I don't know exactly what the proper name for the religion would be, but there was a time when Judaism wouldn't even be the correct name for the faith, other than the faith of Abraham, the cult of Yahweh, whatever, because when it was, or the faith of Israel, because Judah is just the southern tribe of Israel that remained after the northern 10 tribes kind of disappeared, or broke off first and then disappeared. And they all originally started out with this similar faith. But when you look at these people and you actually see their literature or talk to them and see what it is they actually have to say when they talk about it, we don't find that Judaism has a past where it was where's a majority view that Satan was anything other than a personification. Every culture does different odd things with the way it talks about various issues, and of course, we even see in the Bible the personification of wisdom spoken as if it was a woman, and now they don't always personify wisdom, but they did. But had they had the habit of always personifying wisdom, I think we'd probably have some Christian doctrines today that would be claiming that instead of a trinity, we're dealing with a quadrinity or whatever, that wisdom would be one of the co members of the Godhead, as it were. But And I think that in some ways that this is a cross-cultural thing. It's interesting to note as we look back at this, and I want to take a look at some of the problems that involve in this concept, but also to talk about some of the practical implications of what's going on with all of this. And but before I do that, I want to make sure I'm in a position where I can see any of the comments that Joey will send my way. Feel free to lend your comments. Um, the, uh, the Jewish traditions have the concept that they and I'm not really good at my Jewish pronunciations, but they had this thing called the Yetzer Hara, which was the Jewish term for man's inclination towards a continuum that ran all the way from just self-focus, which wasn't always seen as a bad thing, to outright evil, and that this from a neutral focus on self to actually a very very selfish um, attitude in oneself. That this is sometimes man's less glorious aspects, not necessarily always wrong, uh, but his self focus, his self centeredness at times. And after all, we are selves, and sometimes we do need to take a look at ourselves and look at things from our own standpoint, and that is, in a sense, self-centered, but not necessarily always wrong. But that this self to evil and this tendency of our inclination to operate that way was referred to them as the Yetzer Hara, and this is personified by Satan in them. And they also had the opposite concept of the Yetzer Hatav, which was their term for man's inclination towards this continuum from just a general focus to others to doing good to others. And there was comfort in making the good that we have a tendency to do something that we're going to own as having been done by our own person. But it was sometimes a little easier, perhaps, in that culture to talk about and assign the less comely tendencies of our behavior and of our motivation, and talk about it in a personified way, as if this is Satan. Um, so, as I understand it, Satan in the even in the text of the Bible is a role or a title, and it's not a name. And it comes from words that have a tendency to be understood as involved with the concepts of opposition, obstruction, accusation, adversarial things like this, used in contexts such as that. Now, I do find it interesting to note that, oftentimes in the Bible, we find that there are characters in the Bible who have a name that is just the perfect name for their role in the story. And people want to believe that this is just the amazing, you know, uh, sovereignty of God having worked this out. That people would happen to have the names that take on a meaning that is perfect for the story. I don't think that people appreciate that there are many um, sections of the Bible where the history is embellished, but not because for them this was something dishonest. For them, history didn't have anything to do with, you know, studying the past so that we understand all the things that led up to the present day. That wasn't why they needed history. They could care less what was happening yesterday in many ways. It didn't matter what was happening yesterday. Okay, so who was Genghis Khan? When you're working out there in the field every day, trying to make sure you have enough crops and that the beasts that you have are healthy and that the boundaries are safe, you don't care about some of those things from the past. It isn't important. It has no real relevance in your life. But not to say that people didn't have traditions, oral histories, and they did. But it appears to me that many of these oral histories served the purpose of maintaining a national identity. I think a great example of this is the story of Ruth. I get the impression from reading various different documents that Ruth was a real person, but that the story we get of Ruth is in some ways uh, a documentary that with dramatization done, so that what happened was this Ruth had a real impact on the nation and their sense of identity. And so the story gets retold in a way that really makes it very clear, takes away all of the ambiguity, cleans up the story in a way so that it works perfectly, so that they can know exactly who they are. And so the history serves as the purpose of solidifying an identity. It didn't have any purpose in trying to determine what the facts actually were. And I would even want to argue that it's not they'd say, well, let's fool these people into thinking this is their real history so that they'll have this identity. I don't think people took it very seriously. They didn't think that this was the real history. They just knew this was their tradition, and they knew it was based on a real history, loosely, so as to help summarize and maintain in an oral tradition, because they didn't have a lot of books back then, something that helped them to maintain and keep organized as an identity as a corporate body and as a people. And so I think that the text comes to us that way with many of these kinds of things going on in it. And what happens is today, when we do have the opportunity of history, we have the documents, we have manuscripts, we have the ability to nail some of these things down to the floor. We also have a far more sophisticated ability in attempting to determine any of the relevance that might be involved in any of that history. And so now, particularly being a Western culture, now our history is one that we want to keep with the right facts, the who, the what, the where, the when, sometimes the how, and if we can determine it, the why. And so that we are definitely living in a culture today that is far more biased towards wanting our history to be based on the facts, uh, and uh, and not serving any other purpose. But I think that originally history, particularly for Israel, had every purpose in giving them an identity. I don't want to. I don't want to bother you any with this, but I don't actually believe that Israel ever spent any time in Egypt. I don't know if there's any independent evidence that they did, but I do think it's possible that as a clan that they were oppressed by some sort of slave owning uh, organization, some slave owning country or clan that was very powerful and difficult to break away from, and that this story of Moses and Pharaoh is just a way of exaggerating through story a concept of what happened to them, what their past was, that they were slaves and that they were up against a formidable uh, opponent. Let me bring back a name from the other show. I mean, what if they were actually under the power of some Uba Juba, somebody nobody knows, you know? Well, and so you tell the story and you kind of have to explain who Uba Juba was. You know, well, are you up against Pharaoh? Well, Egypt was the most powerful nation in the world. This that you clearly see the role that Pharaoh plays in that story. So I really don't take the history as being accurate, and I don't take it necessarily as having any need to be accurate. And I don't think that those people back in those days had any impression that it was indeed accurate. Although I would wonder if they would at times wonder how much of it was accurate or how, and might have varying opinions. And I don't think it matters. What matters was whether or not it gave them a sense of an identity of who they were, and that they had a reasonable belief that these oral traditions that they had were based on something that at that moment in history when it occurred really did have a significant impact upon them as a people, and that this oral tradition was brought about as in a way that helped to solidify and keep permanent the benefits of what was perceived as being the outcome of those events that may have actually happened. So, kind of loosely based on some real history. That's at least the impression I get of a lot of the Old Testament history. Let me take a little sip here. It's important, I think, to recognize that it's in Christianity and also in Islam. There is this sense of the Satan being a real person, but that this is not the strong sense we get from the Jewish faith in terms of what we even long before even Augustine, we find some of these oral traditions being written down and committed to documents where it's already quite clear that Satan was regarded as a mythical figure, as a personification of the inward inclinations of human beings. And even when you go back to the book of Job, which is one of the earliest books of the biblical text that is ever written, here, right at the very beginning of this oldest book of all, we find Satan apparently being one of the members of the divine court and the advisors to God, as it were. And they begin talking about Job, and Satan is definitely personified here. But to me, that and numerous other things are reasons why I regard the book of Job to be a marvelous work of allegorical fantasy and fiction with a real purpose to it, and that it personifies a lot of these things, and that I think this was actually the beginning of the personification of Satan. To have him in the book of Job, the oldest book of their tradition and text, to bring about Satan as a person, as it were, in the story, is the reason why from that day forward they always spoke of this tendency in us as if it were a person, as just a cultural habit of the way they did it. And I think it begins with Job. And part of the reasons why I would even argue that Job does this is because towards the end of the book, when God says to Satan, you have incited me against my servant. If we're to understand the theology of that story as something other than a fantasy of spiritual allegory of the value of the person and the implications we have when they go through in just unbelievable suffering, that what we're seeing here in that theology is something I think it makes it difficult to understand how God does not take responsibility for his own choices, decisions, actions, and things that he gets involved in. And so I think it opens up a little bit of mud that a lot of Christians may not be willing to admit to, or say, well, they may want to dismiss that. But I think that if you're going to come at the book and look at it for what it is a work of fiction, a beautiful book that I think works towards its purpose, and that this is the very beginning of the personification of Satan. Okay, we got a comment here. Viewer comment. I prefer the legend of Krampus, a beast-like demonic creature, arch enemy of Saint Nicholas, who would carry off the particularly naughty children into the forest and punish them during the Yule season. Having been a parent, I shouldn't say anything. Isn't it amazing some of the horrible stories we invent, thinking that they will either appease our frustrations or make our children behave? But okay, you can prefer that if you like, and but I do think that that for the Hebrew culture, that the personification of Satan was their way of distancing themselves comfortably with the recognition that within all of us there are these things that where we oppose ourselves, where we accuse ourselves, where we doubt ourselves, where we are obstruct ourselves, where we are our own adversary. And that this is and it comes from usually being thoughtless, lacking in empathy, and comes from the kind of dark side of self, as it were. So anyway, so that's where we're at. Oh, we got more comments here. I totally agree, Bob. These are just stories that people made up to control their children, or religious governments to control their populace. Yes, yeah, I'd have to agree with that. Now, one of the things I think is important for us to take a look at here is that in this linguistic personification, that the assumption in the culture is that God is to be loved and obeyed, and there's this recognition that well, we don't always love and obey God, do we? And so why? What is this? And so there's this recognition of this conundrum inside of us, and this is where the personification gets its where it's born from. In the love and obedience that is opposed, man struggles inside of himself with what noble motivations should I have, and I don't always really want to do what is the good thing. And can I be honest with myself about that? And in some ways, it's difficult to be honest with myself. And I think that depending on how you spin it, it some people might think of it as a useful technique to, well, take those motivations inside of you, personify them, pretend as if and talk about them as if it's some other person. And now you can be a little bit more harsh with the realities of that tendency in you by forgetting that it's you are actually analyzing. More comments. Wouldn't it be nice if the smarter people of the past, not so smart after all, had been patient with their people and allowed them to grow up? These crazy legends have stunned the spiritual and mental growth of civilization. I'm actually going to have some mixed feelings about that particular comment. I I don't know exactly that we understand the plotting forward of human civilization and in our getting our act together. But I do think that there are times when we make certain advances that are far from the advances we need to make, and then we get stuck there. And then, as part of culture makes more advances, there's some people still stuck back in the past, um, and they can't move on. And so it's important that we not get stuck at these transitional points. But it's possible that some of these transitional points are nonetheless a far better situation than what happened before we got to that transitional point. I think an example of that, if I lost you, was the when Moses talked about an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. I don't think you realize that prior to the day of that becoming the law, as it were, that if you owned a slave and you were displeased with your slave, you can do anything you wanted to your slave. It was your slave and you owned it. It was your property and you had the right to do this and right to that. There was nobody who was going to come across to you and condemn you for what you might do to your slave. And when we first come across this eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, we find that although it does allow for vengeance, it restrains vengeance to being something equitable, which I think in the day that first came out, it was a restraint. And I think that later, as civilization grows up and we find ourselves not as inclined to always wanting this vengeance and recognize vengeance is mine, says the Lord, and stuff like that, as we kind of grow out of that immaturity, well, we find, well, the law does tell you an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And now we're digging in our vengeance and we're turning what was originally a restraint, a voice of restraint, into a voice of permission. So I don't have to, if possible, to grow into even better restraints. I don't have to do it. Along comes Jesus and he talks about loving your enemy, doing good to those who persecute you. So I see in some sense a progress in culture. And I think that if we get stuck on some of the milestones of that culture, we can turn it into something that isn't really very good. But I don't think that we have the knowledge, the background to necessarily judge the quality or the value of some of those milestones. They will at some level, I think, be for us a mystery. So I don't really know how to judge. That's at least the sense I can give to it, but I don't even know if I'm correct. Necessarily. So, but I do see the room for that kind of trajectory. And so let's just move forward from where we are and what we know, what we need to do. I think that we'll do well if we can do that. I need to put my clock up here so I can see what I'm doing for time here. Let's see if I can get my clock up. Here we go. Now, when we look at this, let's ask ourselves other questions about, what is opposed, what is obstructed, what is the accusation, what is the adversary's goal, what is this adversarial goal? I had mentioned before that obedience was something that was an assumption of this culture, and they realized that we were not always inclined to obey. not only we're not inclined to obey, um, we lack the motivation to be loving, to be obedient. And we oftentimes found that we would prefer to do things that would actually make being loving and obedient even more difficult to do. So that we find those obstructions are a part of where we're at in our mixed feelings. We also find that our value as people, it ends up being attacked by this darker side of self, as it were, that we don't know who we are. We don't know if we're really acceptable because of this dark side that we have, this tendency we have to be selfish and self-focused. The Darth Vader inclination, says the viewer, the dark side personification. Um, yeah, I guess, sure. And you know, and the identity that we have. Well, who are we really if there's this inclination in us? Who really are we? Do we know who we are? Do we know who we're becoming? Where we're going? Um, so that we, these are parts of what I see the role of this dark side. Now, I find it interesting to note that, first of all, I even think of like where Jesus says to Peter, get behind me, Satan. First of all, are we going to argue that we have a viewer comment here? It says collective punishment as something wrong is a modern notion. World War II era, it was common. Um, yeah, I think we're definitely in a trajectory moving away from punitive, and I think we're still lost too much in a punitive approach. And part of the reason why we're coming out of it is not because we're just becoming gentler, nicer people, but rather we now have actual studies of human behavior where we're now able to see how counterproductive it is. It made sense, at least felt good and made sense. But the more educated we become, we begin to realize that it doesn't work. I mean, maybe it would be fun or nice if, whatever, if it seemed to work. But since it doesn't work, we're now stuck in a situation where we have to decide, well, let's find a way of response. Since the past is gone, yesterday's never coming around, and tomorrow is going to be here. And if we're alive, we're going to face it and we're going to kiss tomorrow. Let's make our decisions not based on what we feel like doing. Let's base our decisions based on what's going to make tomorrow a better tomorrow to have to deal with. And let's be honest about it instead of trying to justify it by some crazy philosophy. Let's look at it in an educated manner. So we need to move forward with that, with an eye towards that which is most conducive to a useful and meaningful future. I look at this situation with Peter. Now, are we to believe that Satan is a real person and he somehow comes upon Peter in this moment? And with Satan filling Peter, all Jesus is going to do is get behind me, Satan. Now, if I was to believe that Peter really was, say, indwelt or overcome or, somehow possessed by Satan, I would think that would be a rather traumatic thing for him, particularly since he was the one who just said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God," and that Jesus is complimenting Peter on this amazing insight that he has come to, having been sensitive to the Spirit of God, having been taught by realizing this, and now get behind me, Satan. If we are to assume that Peter and Jesus really believe that Satan is a real being, this is a significant event that I think requires a little different attention than that which it got, and particularly since we just move on from it. But if we understand that Satan is the personification of self-centeredness, that when Jesus rebukes Peter, he's saying, look, you may have just declared that I'm the Christ, the Son of the living God, and I know I complimented you, but let's not lose focus here. Let's not lose balance. That doesn't mean everything that you think is really a good idea. And I think it even brings balance to the puffed head that Peter could have had after being the one who got the answer right to the Messiah. So by recognizing that this character of Satan is really a personification of self and the inner struggles that we have of forsaking wisdom in light of that which feels good or serves ourselves. That this really gives Peter pause. It doesn't make him wonder, I need to seek out Jesus for deliverance or something. That's not what's going on here. Um, the other thing is that we look at the temptation of Jesus. Now, I'm going to argue that it was this culture's way of always talking about this side of ourselves that causes that culture to always speak of it in a personified manner. And so this is why I believe that the text talks about Jesus being led out, by the Spirit of God, to be tempted of the devil 40 days. Anyway, let's look at these temptations. What are they like? They are the questions we all ask. A lot of people think that Jesus was tempted to turn bread into stone. I realize the text talks about that, but I think you missed the point. The, the temptation here is this. If you are the Son of God, command these stones to be bread. The temptation, as I see it, is Jesus is being tempted to assert and prove that he is the Son of God and to solve the problems he's going through or the challenge he's going through in a way that proves who he is. In other words, Jesus is being tempted to make his identity the issue. He's been out there praying and fasting. He's now hungry, very hungry. And of course, I've fasted sometimes for a number of days, and you find your hunger disappears. And so you can go 30 days fasting and you don't feel hungry after a while. But then there comes a time when, it's going to come back around. Now, I think that Jesus is tempted. He's out there. He's about ready to begin his ministry. Before he begins his ministry, he needs a clear sense of who he is, why he is here, what he needs to do. And he needs to understand this so clearly that it is for him no longer even an issue. And so I see this temptation as an attempt to turn his identity into the issue. I mean, all of us can naturally desire that people know us for who it is we think we are, or and some of us are not always sure who we are. And we'd like there to be some solid and clear sense of that. And instead we need to acquire it. And so I think Jesus, in a sense, is solidifying this for himself, in a sense, by facing that temptation. Am I going to allow who I am to be the issue here? Am I going to resolve and deal with the problems in life and the challenges that I have and the needs that I have by asserting and proving who it is that I am? And of course, in that case, it would have been proving to himself, that by turning the bread into stone, hey, there you go. I got this power. I can do this, And I don't even know if that's if that's anything but a hypothetical way of expressing the genre of the temptation, or if that's the actual temptation. I don't know. I don't really care either. But it could be symbolic of that. I don't know. Then he's also taken up to the pinnacle of the temple. Now, in this story, do you really think that Jesus is somehow lifted up by Satan up to the pinnacle of the temple? And then he says, if you're the Son of God, he's commanded all these angels to not let you, dash your foot against a stone. Why don't you jump off? And well, here again, it begins with, if you are the Son of God. Well, first of all, I'll tell you what, if he was really lifted up to the pinnacle of the temple, really, literally, that in and of itself would be quite an impressive feat. People go, look at that guy. Up there. I wonder what's going on. So I see this somehow as allegorical in the story. I'm not so sure I even understand what all the allegory is. But again, this is something that Jesus can do to prove his limits, to determine his limits. Just how far can he take this? And still be who he is? And does he need to prove he is who he is by how far he can take it? But wasn't the identity of Jesus integral to what he accomplished? Yes, I would agree it was. Yeah. Could it have been just anyone who accomplished what he did, or could it be only God's Son? And if only God's Son, then why isn't that the issue? It's not the issue, because if he is God's Son, he needs to be God's Son, not prove he's God's son. And so I think that's the point. What I'm saying is, I'm not saying it isn't a question, and I'm not saying it isn't a legitimate question. I'm saying he has to have this question so settled that it's no longer an issue. He needs to make decisions in his future ministry that have nothing to do with trying to prove who he is. He needs to go into this ministry being fully persuaded so that that isn't even an issue that gets provoked. And so, and that's when I'm saying it's not the issue, I'm not saying it's not important. I'm just saying it's got to be something that moves beyond whether or not we have a question about it. You know, um, for example, I'm a professor at a college, and I teach a couple of subjects there. When I go into the classroom, I'm not going to be a very good teacher if I feel the way I teach, I need to prove to these students that I'm a well-educated person, that I know what I'm talking about. And so I better make sure that my lectures include all the big words and that I conduct myself where I make it very clear that I am this well-educated person, well worthy of all the respect of a professor and all that. Give me a break. These kids don't need some pompous idiot up there lecturing to them in some sort of lecturese that is difficult to understand. I'm there to help these kids learn some things. And so I want my lectures to be based upon what it is they need to know, and whether or not I am the person truly qualified to be teaching them. That shouldn't be an issue that I am dealing with or struggling with when I'm teaching them. And if I let that be an issue, I am going to be trying to prove myself instead of teaching them the things they need to know. But didn't Jesus offer many proofs of who he was throughout his ministry? I'm sure there were many things that were, depending on what you mean by that word offer, I'm sure there are many things. And Peter actually comes to the point, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And this is based upon the things that happened. So I'm arguing that this was something that Jesus was he was too busy being himself and completely ignoring any need to prove who he was, and that who he was not the issue. Being who he was, and being was more the point. And I would even imagine that it's impossible to be who you are if being who you are involves making who you are the issue. Um, you're always out to prove something instead of, I mean, what if I need to prove to my wife that I love her? If I love her, I'm focused on her and her value and the celebration of it. But if I'm trying to prove to her that I love her, now the focus is on me. I want her to know that I love her. Well, I'm sorry. To me, that is not a loving thing to do. Now, I'm sure that many of the times the way that I behave, it offers her proof that I do. But I don't want that to ever be in our relationship the kind of an issue. I don't want her to ever have to feel like she needs to prove to me that she loves me. Good enough that she does. Good enough that she even struggles with what that means and how to do that, and likewise with me. Your comment, that was gigantic. It's not about who you are and I are. It's about the whole world. Your comment, before we continue this discussion, please prove to us all now that you are Bob and that you are very unconventional. No, I'm not going to do that. If you're going to think of me as Bob, you're just going to have to figure that one out for yourself. And if you think I'm unconventional, you're just going to have to come to that conclusion yourself. In fact, many times I used to begin this show by saying, well, I'm Bob Greaves, and they call me the unconventional pastor. It's actually a name I adopted because people called me that, and so it's an identity that I adopted after having had it assigned. But let me get back to these temptations about from Jesus, and we'll get back to some of these viewer comments, and they're good. Some of them are quite funny too. But that third temptation of Jesus, if he would bow down and worship Satan, that he would give him all the kingdoms of the world. There's a sense here where I understand the temptation, if you are the Son of God, that Jesus is finding he has been sent, in some ways on a mission. He realizes, I believe that as he's beginning this ministry, that he senses this powerful need to preach the kingdom of God is among you, that the reconciliation is beginning, and that there's to be this restoration of all. and that there's nothing that Jesus would love more than to bring it all together, to really have it happen. And and it can make sense to us to um, sometimes like the boss at work. If the boss comes to work someday and saying, "I need to show these people who's the boss," I guarantee you that boss is going to make decisions that day that prove that not that he's the boss, but prove that he's an ass, you know, and that isn't going to work. You know, he doesn't need to prove he's the boss. He needs to be the boss. He needs to make the decisions. He needs to take ownership and responsibility. He needs to take the people under his wings. He needs to address the problems. He needs to deal with the people who need to be dealt with. And he needs to do it in a productive way. He needs to be the boss. But the moment he's there trying to prove he's the boss, that's the moment he stops really being the boss and starts alienating everybody. And yet it feels many times to the darker side, as it were, that hey, if I need the authority here, instead of going through the hard work of winning credibility and of earning the loyalty of people through my leadership, both in the way that I do stand up for them and the way I stand up for myself as well, but through the exhibition of appropriate and well balanced leadership, I become the boss they admire and will follow because they see that I come to work in a manner where I'm prepared to lead, prepared to accept responsibility, and it gets inspiring in that way. That can be a very different thing. But it can be tempting for all of us to just try to find that way of, well, let's just establish that right now and have everybody just kind of conform to that, what we've established. That in a sense, Jesus is discovering in this last temptation that he needs to fully abandon turning who he is into the point and merely turning his mission. I mean, if you're God, you're God. What does it matter who understands this and who doesn't understand this? Do what you do as God. You do what you do as the Son of God, and it'll get done, you know? So he comes to this point where he realizes from this day forward, this isn't about proving who I am. Now, if the things that I do happen to persuade many people as an evidence of who it is I am, wonderful. It's not that the truth is this: refusing to allow yourself to be known for who you are is also turning that into an issue. If it's a non-issue, then if the things that you do make people realize you're the Christ, then it makes them realize you're the Christ. But it's not the issue. And so I really see the temptations of Jesus here as a recognition of where are the priorities and where does what Jesus would want for himself come into play in this. And I believe that in these temptations, Jesus comes away from this choosing love over self-assertion. And that we see this in a personified story. And that it's in this exact same sense that we have later Jesus rebuking Peter. Because Jesus knows that there's certain things that are going to have to work out the way they're going to have to work out, because of the way it's going to be, if he's really going to accomplish the things that need accomplishing, and Jesus is struggling toward it, and Peter's saying things that can resonate with a desire to not necessarily pursue that. And so there's a sense in which when Jesus says to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan," it's even ambiguous here. Are we talking about the Satan in Peter, or are we talking about the Satan in Jesus, as it were? That part of Jesus that later is going to struggle. Father, if this is not your will, let it pass from me. And or Peter's desire that, look, we don't want anything bad to happen to you ever. You know, we just want everything to be, love, peace all the time. And why can't we all just get along? And some of those unrealistic fantasies, that isn't going to work. And so we see this. But anyhow, regardless of where this is, and by the way, I don't think it's important that you accept my view of it. I just am trying to explain this, that I do see Satan as a personification of that side of ourselves that is the darker side, the side of ourselves that needs to prove ourselves, to make ourselves the issue, to make the question of our value or of our identity to be that which leads us down a very bad path. And not that we don't have questions of identity. We all do. But I think we need to solve and resolve those issues so that they are not an issue that comes up when it's time for us to be ourselves. We should never be trying to prove who we are. Just discover who we are and then be that. And I think that's part of what Jesus did here. Viewer comments. Being who you are is non-ego based, but proving who you are is then ego. Uh, Essentially, that's another good way of putting it. I can agree with that. And before we continue this discussion, please prove to us all now that you. Oh, no, I've already read that comment. Okay, well, I'm just me, and it works out this way. And and I would encourage many of you to just be yourselves. Find out who you are, and just be that, and find a way of discovering the awesome dignity and loveliness that there is in that. And while you're getting that for yourself, give that to others. Let them be who they are. And if there's any changes or improvements they need to make in their lives, let them discover what those are based upon the foundation of who they are, not who you're trying to turn them into. Um, Viewer comment agreed. Let's see. Oh, no, we just, okay, right. Okay. Don't read that. Oh, I just did. Must have been my dark side. What can I say? Well, anyway, I think that we want to just wrap up with talking about some of the implications of this. When we turn Satan into a real entity, I think we now slip away from that technique of comfort by putting at least a comfortable distance between us and these tendencies. By actually now failing to take genuine responsibility for ourselves. Let's take responsibility for the fact that we're not all fully ready to jump into life and all of its challenges, being the loving, selfless people that it would be good for us to be. There's a sense in which we're aware of the risks. We're afraid of the costs at times, and that's a perfectly normal thing to do. Uh, eh, but let's not distance ourselves so much that we are no longer accepting complete responsibility for our motivations, for our decisions, for our sense of self, for our sense of when it's appropriate and balanced to be focused upon ourselves, and when it's focused, proper and balanced to be focused on others. Let's not at any moment give ourselves the opportunity to be irresponsible in owning these things. It's my life. It's my decisions. It's my behaviors. And I need to own these as mine. Now, I'll grant you this. Not a single one of us possesses all the skills and all the competency necessary to take that responsibility and handle it perfectly. None of us do. That's not the point. We are growing into learning how that responsibility is best lived out. But like a child who can't do a lot of these things, but learns through seeing the modeling of adults and learns through their own practice, through their own experimentation, and they become an adult. So they're on this trajectory of growing towards this fullness of being everything they were ever destined to be. It's something that we are working towards and arriving at. But we can't ever arrive at it if we allow certain milestones in that road to be something we can successfully disown responsibility for. And so I really think that in the end, the moral implications of actually believing in a real Satan is that we fail to take seriously the complete role we as people with mixed feelings, mixed concerns, uncertainties that are worth having and need to be resolved. But by not taking responsibilities for these issues, we really stall ourselves. And so I see some real spiritual danger in entertaining too strongly this concept. Of Satan being an actual real person. I realize that's the majority view among a lot of people, particularly those who would take faith seriously. Um, but I've come to a point where I just don't see it as tenable or useful. And and I think that by abiding in the love of God and in the presence that He has in our lives, that this is the future and the power of our future, that this is the power of that resurrection life in us, and that this is what we're headed towards. Well, anyhow, thank you for so much of your participation. I'm glad we had a chance to talk about this. and I can genuinely appreciate if some of the things that I've shared with you strike you as being a little, not only a little bit odd, but very contrary to tradition, and it really is. But I've come to the point where I am comfortable with that conclusion, and I hope that it gave you some things to think about. So, until the next time, this is Bob Graves. They call me the unconventional pastor, and I'll see you next time. Take care.